Madam Speaker. I'm dividing my time with the member from Vancouver Centre. Madam Speaker, prorogation can be mostly for benign reasons. In this case, it was not. Done arbitrarily and out of this government's own convenience, it was done to shut down voices that the government did not want to hear. While that may be very human, for a democratic society, for Canada, it is a big problem. The Prime Minister does not like a lot of different voices. Not in his caucus, not in his cabinet, not in committees, not in the bureaucracy, not in media, not anywhere. During his now more than 4 years in office, think of any big public discussion his government has generated on the transforming issues of today and of the future, on the changing national and international economy, on global security, on climate change, on energy, on anything. Nothing, Madam Speaker. The Prime Minister does not like other voices. Other voices might be critical or embarrassing or inconvenient. They may simply be different from his own. He knows where he wants to go. He thinks he is right. So why do these voices matter? Prorogation was just part of it. In his more than 4 years as Prime Minister, he has used and misused the power of his position, its rewards and punishments, to entice and intimidate, to play on human weakness, to prop up voices he wants to hear, and to shut down those he doesn't want to hear. All this may be very human, but for a democratic society, for Canada, it is a big problem. This past Monday, we brought together about 20 community groups from across the country, some national and international, some small and local, who after years, sometimes decades of receiving federal government money to do important community services and to give voice to those who are less advantaged, to help them to live the way all Canadians should live, they had their funding cut. Aboriginal groups, health groups, women's groups, learning, child care, international aid groups, and others. Yet this roundtable was not really about their funding cuts. It was about what the loss of the services and the voice they provided means to their communities, means to Canada. These cuts, this different understanding of the importance of public voice, represents a great change from previous governments. From the Liberal governments of the 1970s and early 80s, from the Progressive Conservative governments of the late 80s and early 90s, from the Liberal governments again until 2006. When I was Minister of Social Development, my responsibilities included those for seniors, people with disabilities, the volunteer sector as a whole, childcare. People who worked for advocacy groups on these issues did so because they believed in these issues and knew that so much more needed to be done. These groups pushed hard. We got to know each other, maybe even trust each other a little, but these groups were intensely politically nonpartisan and intensely issue partisan. They had to deal with whoever was the government. At times, they drove me crazy. Sometimes they were too right, uncomfortably right, when it wasn't sure that I could deliver that right. Sometimes I thought they were completely wrong, that to meet their own goals and mine, they wanted to go down the wrong path. But I knew what every party for decades had known, that these voices are part of the essential mix of voices necessary for a properly functioning, healthy society. Then, in 2006, the Conservatives won. During the first 3 or 4 months, for these groups, there were signs of trouble, but to them, they hoped it was just a matter of getting used to a new government and a new government getting used to them. They had seen it before, whether a Liberal or Progressive Conservative government, and eventually they knew they would get through to that government and everything would end up roughly as it was. But not this time. The Core Challenges program, cuts to women's groups, literacy, childcare, Aboriginal groups. At first, groups in these areas thought that they were the only ones affected. I'd say to them, you keep waiting for the train to arrive at the station. This train is not coming. This Conservative government thinks differently. It says to itself, why should we give money to these groups? We're the government. It's our job to reflect the different voices in the country. Besides, if these issues had any real public support, people would give to these groups themselves. Besides, if any money does go to these groups, it should go directly to the people in need, to feet on the ground, not to mouths in corner offices. And besides, why would anybody in their right mind support someone who just criticizes them anyway? All this might be very human, but for a democratic country, for Canada, it is a big problem. And we all knew, and the government knew what would happen next. For these groups, their effectiveness, their voice, their existence threatened, they would go nuts. Instead, most have gone quiet. I think this even surprised the government at first. Then it realized the power it had. Essentially, it said to these groups, you thought you were wrong. You thought you were strong. You are not. You need our money, and now you have a choice. You can go quiet and maybe get some money, but not likely and certainly a lot less. And by going quiet, you become powerless. Or you can go loud and certainly not get any money and become powerless. So what do you want? To be powerless or powerless? For the government, it meant they could keep their money and keep these groups quiet. Life doesn't get much better. On Monday, together, some of these groups told their story. Many others are still not willing to. There was also someone who took part who decided to do so only by phone because a government contract is pending for a group she'd like to work for, and she didn't feel she could put herself or this group at risk by being identified. This is a person who has a reputation for fighting every fight, loudly, publicly, never taking a backward step. But it's all about shutting down voices. Another group whose funding has not been cut had intended to be there to show solidarity with the other groups because this group knows that there, but for the grace of one cabinet minister who has a personal interest in the issue that is its focus, this group might be cut too. But in the end, the group decided it couldn't risk being there. In one way or another, again, shutting down voices. That's what the roundtable was about. Not about groups losing their funding, but about what the loss of funding means, what the loss of services and the voices they provide means to local communities and the national community, what it means to all of us. Here's what some of them said. One said, I'm acutely aware that today there may be consequences associated with speaking publicly about social and political issues of importance to Canadians. That person went on, few would deny that the chill is real and that this is a new development in Canadian democracy. Another said, organizations are now afraid to be visible in a press conference. And about groups which historically have too few resources to act alone, this person continued, we are divided by fear, divided by a race to survive financially. And the result, distrust, fear, and a lack of cohesiveness. And another said, we are witnessing some of the most prominent organizations in this country being silenced, reduced, ensuring that the government will have little or no opposition to their actions and policy. It seems that NGOs have been given two choices: stay quiet and don't represent the challenges facing vulnerable Canadians, or voice those issues and quietly disappear. These words do not convey their full stories, nor the tone of their voices. Their tone was one of sadness, anger, disappointment in themselves for being so weak in the face of their organization's survival, for turning against other groups, for turning selfish and greedy, for being so unlike what they ever thought they were. More than that, their tone was one of disbelief and denial. This cannot be happening. It is not possible that I stop myself before I say what needs to be said. This is not Canada. These groups knew their own story and knew the stories of those in their own sector, but they were stunned by the other voices they heard and how broad and how deep the problem goes. I think it took so long for these groups to speak out because of this disbelief, because of a feeling that surely they were the only ones and no one else would understand, and also because to say something about losing their funding would sound to others like sour grapes and would sound self-serving, as if they really didn't have the right to say something. It's the same story for all the opposition political parties and for the media. We are losing our voice, but what right do we have to say something? Sour grapes, self-serving. But this isn't, first of all, most of all, about us. This is about the public, about Canadians, about how this country works. That gives us a right, Madam Speaker. That gives us an obligation.
Questions.